Ingrid Laubrock is joining us, saxophonist and composer. She was born in West Germany in 1970, then a longtime resident of London before coming to New York a decade ago. And that's where she's connecting from. Ingrid, thanks for chatting with us. We were just listening to Milton Babbitt's All Set, then to a track from your new album with the same title. How did that project come about?
It's actually the person who co-wrote the record with me, Stéphane Payen, an amazing French saxophonist and composer. We know each other for a long time because he came over to London when I was in a collective called the Fire Collective, and he was in a collective called Ask in Paris. And Stéphane actually came over for a series of rhythmic workshops.
This was in 2002, yes?
I think so. I think it was around that time, 2002. And he emailed me in 2018 and said, would you be interested in putting together this project that basically uses the pitch arrays and the idea of the Babbitt composition All Set. We put together a quartet and wrote 4 to 5 compositions each using the Milton Babbitt material, pitch material, and also some other ideas of his.
Some other ideas of Babbitt's.
Yes, for this particular piece, All Set, he also uses some rhythmical ideas called time points, which I have used in compositional in one of my compositions for this record.
Where you're deriving rhythmic values from the pitches in the set.
You are basically allocating starting points to certain pitches. Certain divisions in a measure are allocated to certain pitches. So I transposed that kind of systems to triplets and to quintuplets and had some sort of rhythmic grid that I would use for the composition and then get away from it because I'm not, it was just a rhythmic grid that I decided to use for the most part and then occasionally deviate from.
Interesting. Now, the Babbitt composition is entirely written out. There's no improvisation, though it uses the instrumentation and some of the rhythms of, mid-50s jazz. Is that true of the pieces on your album? How much is composed? How much is improvised?
It's a real mixture of things. All pieces employ improvisation. There's a fair amount of writing, even for the drums. Like Stéphane's pieces have some through composed drum parts. Mine do not, or at least like vamps or rhythmic drum patterns. Mine tend to not do that. But there is a fair amount of writing for all the instruments that is sort of woven together with improvisation.
Now, you play tenor saxophone mostly. That's an instrument that has a lot of weight attached to it in the history of improvised music. How did you come to choose it?
I think the first thing that brought me to the saxophone in general was hearing Kind of Blue. At the time, Cannonball Adderley was sort of my guy. I thought he was much better than John Coltrane.
And he was an alto player.
I know. It's just one of those things, I wasn't ready, I think. So I started on alto and picked up the tenor maybe 3-4 years later. Because I guess I fell in love with John Coltrane and Wayne Shorter, and that was just what I was hearing.
I see. So was Cannonball Adderley your gateway drug to John Coltrane?
He may have been a gateway drug, yeah.
I see. But you didn't play saxophone in Germany, is that right?
I started at the very end of living in Germany, but I left really literally the day after my high school was finished. I moved to Berlin for a couple of months and then moved to London just before my 19th birthday, which is where I really picked up the saxophone.
Was it something about the musical life of London that inspired you?
To be honest, at that time, it was just being a teenager wanting to experience life and to have an adventure. It could have been anywhere, I think. It wasn't like I did not move to London for the music. I moved there because it was fun and interesting and an adventure for me at the time.
Much of the music of yours that we've played on Flotation Device uses large ensembles and highly composed structures that still allow for improvisation. Albums like Contemporary Chaos Practices and dreamt twice, twice dreamt. How did you get involved in that particular approach?
Well, I grew up listening to a lot of classical music. My parents are amateur classical musicians, so the sound was kind of always around. And a fantasy of mine was always to write for or to compose for orchestra, to have this like full gamut of color and noise and just this mass of sound and at my disposal. I guess like working with Anthony Braxton, who is always encourages everybody to attack the large beast, sort of opened my mind to it a little bit, and I kind of threw myself into it, and I still love it. I really enjoy having to fully think through a whole piece, and then ripping it apart and adding improvisation.
We're talking with Ingrid Laubrock, composer and saxophonist, who has a new album out called All Set, available from the French label Rogue Art. Ingrid, you're always working on new projects. What's next for you after All Set?
Well, I'm working at a few things currently. I'm mixing a few records. So one of them is a new duo record with Tom Rainey on drums.
He plays drums on All Set.
He plays drums on All Set on many other projects of mine. We also have recorded an improvised record with the bassist Brandon Lopez. This will be coming out on Intact Records next year. I'm also working on mixing a record that I recorded in June with the amazing pianist Andy Milne. Music I composed, and this will be part of my piano saxophone duet series for Intact Records. That's also coming out next year. And I am starting to mix a sextet record with Tomika Reed, Mass Swift, Brandon Seabrook, Tom Rainey, and Michael Formanek. This is music that I actually recorded in 2019. Then the pandemic, and it was supposed to come out last year, but the pandemic hit and kind of threw everything around. So we're resuming that right now.
And that will be coming out on Firehouse 12 Records.
That will be on Firehouse 12. Yes.
And you've got the new duet album with Tom Rainey, your fourth, I believe.
Yes, that is something we're working on at the moment. We recorded it in June. It's a mixture of compositions and improvisations.
We're hearing a sample of that in the background now, and you've recorded extensively with Tom Rainey, as we mentioned earlier. Tenor saxophone and drums, obviously the comparison comes to mind with Interstellar Space, one of the very last Coltrane albums with Rashid Ali. Is there any connection there?
Well, I've always loved late Coltrane. I love all John Coltrane, but I have listened to a lot of the late Coltrane, of course, too. Tom Rainey's and my very first duo concert was for a series that Art for Arts put out here in New York. Art for Arts is an organization that deals with the legacy or promotes the legacy of African American free jazz and free music, improvised music. And they had a series called, I think, Interstellar Space, or celebrating an anniversary of Interstellar Space, and we were invited to participate. So in a way, it is directly related to the record.
Let's go back to All Set. We're about to hear one of your own compositions from that album. Knock Whack, it's called. What's that all about?
Well, it's pretty onomatopoeic, I think, that title.
It kind of has an Ornette Coleman vibe to it, at least as I hear it. Those, well, kind of the short notes.
I was just like, so there's a scale at the beginning, this pitch set of Milton Babbitt. We are like, the saxophone and I, Stefan and I, we're just hitting these hits on cue. I cue them, and then there's a sort of there are 3 points for improvisation in between. Where the hits are basically starting point for very short improvisations. Then there is a theme that is sort of like a driving, fast kind of jazz tune that also has very short, fragmented kind of hit phrases. And a bass line and a drum line that sort of rhythmically create this kind of wobbling texture. It's like it's sort of almost like a tongue-in-cheek, fairly simple composition of mine on this record. That's that employs almost like a head improvisation head form, which I have moved away from over the years.
Yes, you've got a tail in this case, not a head, really.
I have an introduction, a head, an improvisation, and a head.
I
Out.
see.
Yeah, really almost like a jazz tune.
Well, Ingrid Laubrock, composer, improviser, prolific recording artist, thanks so much for visiting with us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's hear Knockwack from the album All Set, music by Ingrid Laubrock, after Milton Babbitt, on flotation device.